Good evening and welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council. It is Monday, December 6th at 7 p.m. My name is William Lutz, President of Council. We begin with the invocation tonight and the Pledge of Allegiance given by Mr. Phillips. Please stand.
Please bow your heads. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all of the comfort and wisdom that you have provided for us with all of your documentation in your Holy Bible. Please wrap your arms around our world and provide the comfort that it needs and deserves, and let the wisdom of your knowledge trickle down to those that need it. Please take into consideration all of the folks that we have on our prayer lists, all of my personal friends that are in need of some comfort and guidance at this point in time. Please guide us with the wisdom of our positions here within the city and protect our city employees that do a marvelous job for all of our residents here in the city. Thank you for this day, and we say these words in your name. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Siebert.
Present.
Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Here.
Mr. Swazer.
Here.
Mrs. Snee. Here. Mr. Twist.
Present.
Mr. Whidden.
Here.
Mr. Rozell.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Present.
All members are present.
We have some enthusiastic members tonight. That's good to see. That's what I just said.
Fruit punch we had.
Mrs. Knight, can you please read the summary of the minutes of the November 15th, 2021 meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes of Council, November 15, 2021. Committee reports. Community and Economic Development Committee had a report regarding a vacant property registration program, and it was stated that staff will research and analyze whether there is a vacant building issue to provide a report in early 2022. There was a recommendation regarding the moratorium on approval of new certificates for demolition in the downtown area, and committee recommended legislation be prepared to establish a 180-day moratorium. Committee considered a moratorium on new surface parking lot construction and recommended legislation to establish a 90-day moratorium. Committee recommended legislation be prepared for 3 legislative items for the Camfarelli annexation. Personnel Committee recommended that the wage ordinance for seasonal and part-time employees be approved. Safety and Health Committee recommended legislation be prepared for the 2020 funding for Miami County Public Health. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing bidding for a street duct bank improvements project. Resolution number R53, 2021, Services for Camfarelli Annexation, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R54, 2021, Buffering Requirements for Camfarelli Annexation, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R55, 2021, Consent to Camfarelli Annexation, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R56, 2021, Agreement with Miami County Public Health for 2022, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R57, 2021, Bid and Contract for West Main Street Duct Bank Improvement Project, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 062, 2021, Approving Salaries for Seasonal Positions, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 063, 2021, Moratorium 180 days for demolition of for demolition of properties or buildings, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 064, 2021, Moratorium 90 days for new surface parking lots, first reading and adopted. Following comments, there was an executive session, and council then adjourned at 7:48 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Council wishes to dispose of the minutes of the November 15th meeting.
Motion to approve.
Second.
It's been moved to approve the minutes by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee? Yes. Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the minutes of the November 29th, 2021 special meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes of council, November 29, 2021, special meeting. The notice of special meeting was read and then signed. Committee reports. Finance Committee recommended approval of the 2022 appropriation ordinance, which is adoption of the budget. Also recommended funding for various agencies. Resolution number R58, 2021, agreement with FOP police officers, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R59, 2021, agreement with FOP Troy Police Sergeants Association, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R60, 2021, agreement with Troy Police Captains Association, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R61, 2021, accepting the settlement agreement related to opioid settlement agreement, was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance 065, 2021, appropriation ordinance, given first reading. Council adjourned at 6:10 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to dispose of the minutes?
Move to approve.
It's been moved to approve.
Second.
By Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Seaver. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
The minutes of the special meeting are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We have two committee reports this evening. We'll begin with the Buildings Committee and Mr. Whidden.
Thank you, Mr. President. On November 29th, this committee met regarding the North Madison Street Lift Station Rehabilitation Project. This project will provide needed maintenance and repairs for the lift station. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the North Madison Street Lift Station Rehabilitation Project at a total cost not to exceed $585,000 or $585,466, respectively submitted by Mr. Twilliger, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Whidden. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the last report this evening in the Streets and Sidewalks Committee of Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, sir. On November 29, committee members Schilling and myself met regarding bidding the traffic signal poles for the West Main Street Improvement Project Phase 1. Bidding the poles separately and ahead of the bidding of the West Main Street Phase 1 project may avoid some of the supply chain problems experienced with the delivery of poles for other projects. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the traffic signal poles for the West Main Street Improvement Project Phase 1 at a cost not to exceed $300,000. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we now open it up to citizens' comments for items on the agenda. We have 5 resolutions and 7 ordinances for discussion tonight on our agenda. If you wish to address council on any of those items, please come to the lectern, give your name and address. You have 2 minutes to address council. Seeing none, we'll move into resolutions. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R62, 2021?
Resolution number R62, 2021. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the North Madison Street Lift Station Rehabilitation Project, cost not to exceed $585,466, and this is the first reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wish to dispose of the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the 3 reading rule by Mr. Terwilliger, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell. Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
Second.
The 3 reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R63, 2021?
Resolution number R63, 2021. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the West Main Street Improvement Project Phase 1 traffic signal poles. Cost not to exceed $300,000. First reading.
How does the council wish to act on the
Move
item?
to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
yes,
Move to adopt. Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, Mr. Schilling.
I happen to be out on West Main Street, and they're out there by Lowe's and Myers, and they're in the process of setting up the traffic lights and that type of thing. And it looked like the poles that they're using out there are black. And my question is on these that we're voting for now, do we have we don't specify color choice or that type of thing? And then the other question I have is that there's no guarantee that when we get these poles, that the second phase poles that we get sometime down the road, are they going to match?
Okay, so I think you have a couple questions there. The color we will specify in the bidding. We do have a specific manufacturer that we're going to be using, particular model, if you will. So Phase 1 and Phase 2 will match.
Okay. Okay. So the bid is just not for, I mean, there's no,
It's not an open-ended bid. We still have specifications that say this is the one we want.
Okay.
This is the color we want.
that's what I was concerned about. Thank you so much.
Okay.
But nothing
Mr.
we're
Rozell.
doing right now goes as far as Jeff's asking out by Lowe's, because.
No, that's the interconnect project
Phase
that's
two's
been
not for the
underway.
interstate.
Right, but those poles look different than what we're used to seeing in, I'm saying, I drove by and I thought they were black. I might be wrong on the color. but-
They are black.
Okay, so why don't those poles match what we're doing on the rest of Main Street?
Is that an ODOT spec or?
Everything other than downtown streetscape is black. So North Market at Fossway and Kirk Lane is black. North Market at Troy Urbana is black. Any mast arm out, I don't know if there's mast arms at Barnhart, mast arms, so anything that we're putting in with mast arms that's outside of the streetscape, which streetscape ends at the edge of, at the end of shore after the Phase 1 project, will be black.
Okay.
We do have a motion to approve the resolution
Yeah.
and adopt it. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
yes,
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R64, 2021?
Resolution number R64, 2021. Resolution authorizing the Board of Recreation of the City of Troy, Ohio to enter into a contract with the Troy Recreation Association, Inc. for recreation services. This is the funding agreement for 2022 in the amount of $29,000. First reading.
How does council wish to act on the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
yes,
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. Moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R65, 2021?
Resolution number R65, 2021, resolution approving funding to Troy Main Street, Inc. for calendar year 2022. The amount will be $60,000. This is the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second. The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Terwilliger. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R66, 2021?
Resolution number R66, 2021. Resolution approving funding to the Troy Development Council for Economic Development for the City of Troy. This is also funding approval for 2022. Total amount $140,000. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schwazer, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move on to ordinances, and Mrs. Knight, will you please read Ordinance 065, 2021?
Ordinance number 065, 2021. Ordinance appropriating funds necessary for the various departments and offices of the City of Troy, Ohio for the year 2022. This is the appropriation ordinance, the adoption of the budget. This is the second reading.
Move for suspension. Second.
It's moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schwazer. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schwazer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
The ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Ordinance 066, 2021?
Ordinance number 066, 2021. Ordinance fixing salaries and wages of certain employees of the City of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is a salary ordinance for police officers, sergeants, and captains for calendar years 2022, 2023, and 2024. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 067, 2021?
Ordinance number 067, 2021. Ordinance fixing salaries and wages of certain employees of the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This ordinance covers the non-bargaining unit employees' salaries for calendar years 2022, 2023, and 2024, and this would be the first reading.
Does the council wish to
Move
add?
to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Terwilliger, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Schwazer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 068, 2021?
Ordinance number 068, 2021. Ordinance fixing salaries and wages of certain employees of the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is the salary ordinance for the FSLA exempt employees. It covers calendar years 2022, 2023, and 2024. First reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
second,
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on, will you please read ordinance 069, 2021?
Ordinance number 069, 2021. Ordinance amending sections of Chapter 141 of the codified ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is one change to the health insurance provision provided for the non-bargaining NFSLA exempt employees, and this would be the first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schwazer, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Schwazer, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee?
yes,
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 070, 2021?
Ordinance number 070, 2021. Ordinance amending ordinance number 056, 2020, as amended by ordinance number 042, 2021, and ordinance number 051, 2021, appropriating funds necessary for the various departments and offices of the City of Troy, Ohio for the year 2021. This is a routine and should be final reappropriation for 2021. First reading.
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee? Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee? Yes. Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. And Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 071, 2021.
Ordinance number 071, 2021. Ordinance to accept the application for the annexation of certain territory containing 12.524 acres, more or less, in Concord Township to the City of Troy, Ohio. This is the final acceptance of the annexation known as Blackmore Hill Annexation, total of 12.524 acres. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Schwazer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee? Yes. Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions this evening? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling? Mr. Schilling?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Mr.
Lull you to sleep.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee? Yes. Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We've come to the end of our legislative items. We move into communications and announcements. And Mrs. Knight, are there any this evening?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Tonight, we have a special presentation this evening. We have Miss Andrea Keller from Troy Main Street to give us a report. Andrea, please come to the lectern and tell us your good news.
Can I pass some things around?
Absolutely.
That's your budget.
Yeah. Good evening. My name's Andrea Keller. I'm the Executive Director of Troy Main Street. I believe most of you are familiar with Troy Main Street, and I think some of you maybe even helped start our organization 31 years ago. So, but for anybody who's not familiar, Troy Main Street is a nonprofit organization, and we focus on the revitalization and historic preservation of downtown Troy. We do this by focusing on what's called the 4 points of Main Street, which are economic vitality, design, promotion, and organization. And on behalf of the Troy Main Street staff and board members, I'd like to thank the City of Troy and the Troy City Council members for continuing to support Troy Main Street through grant funding each year. This funding allows Troy Main Street to continue to retain successful businesses and attract thousands of guests to downtown Troy each year. Some of our initiatives and accomplishments in 2021 included continuing our First Friday events as a monthly event to encourage citizens to spend the first Friday of the month in downtown Troy supporting our downtown businesses. We also partner on several other events that aren't necessarily First Friday events, but those include things like GOBA, the Tour de Donut, the Grand Illumination, bringing the Santa House to downtown Troy so that we can provide free Santa visits to the citizens of Troy. And then in 2021, we also planned and implemented our 10th Biennial Sculptures on the Square program. So I've given you one of our leftover maps and information. We brought 20 sculptures to downtown Troy, and those came from all throughout the United States, and one was from Canada. We also worked with two of our downtown businesses this past year, Mojo's Bar and Grill and Bakehouse Bread and Cookie Company, to help get them a grant from Heritage Ohio for some facade improvement. We also worked with the City of Troy to implement the DORA, the Designated Outdoor Refreshment Area, which you're all very familiar with now. And we continued to edit and distribute our downtown Troy walking maps, so I've given you one of those. This is actually a document that we edited heavily in 2020 because it hadn't been edited in a long time, and it was something that we could edit from home. And we've continued to provide those to our merchants, and that is one of my favorite things we've done because it's one of the most helpful, I think. We also, in 2021, secured 50 business memberships, 11 business sponsorships, and 15 individual memberships, which all contributed to our funding as well. In 2022, Troy Main Street looks forward to continuing our work to create a charming, prosperous, and interactive downtown. Our initiatives for 2022 include working with the city to implement a downtown mural program, continuing our First Friday events and other events that we do. We're taking a survey right now of our downtown businesses to assess what their needs are, and then use that to guide our continued efforts for where we should focus. We plan to maintain our status as a nationally accredited Main Street program. We received that accreditation through Heritage Ohio. And then we plan to continue to navigate the DORA and work with this city to provide feedback and suggestions from businesses within the district. We also plan to work with the city and our design committee to continue the painted pianos project that was done last year, and then several other things that we'll do throughout the year or things that pop up. I also wanted to point out, this is something we did in 2020, but I wanted to make sure that city council members are aware because this is a fun document to have, and I know you all are advocates of downtown Troy and Troy in general, but this is a walking history map of our downtown businesses, and it tells the history of a lot of, I'm sorry, not our downtown businesses, our downtown buildings. And so it tells the history of those buildings. We worked with Patrick Kennedy at the Troy Local History Library and Doug Tremblay to recreate that document. And so we have those in our office if you have people that are interested in those. Again, we want to thank the city staff and the city council people for the innumerable ways that you've all supported Troy Main Street. We feel really blessed to have a city that supports us as a Main Street organization and that sees that value. And one other thing I'd like to just mention, I know in the summer, I think I came here and thanked you all for the street department's help in getting our sculptures installed and de-installed this year. We got so many compliments from artists who were coming to our town for the first time on how helpful and kind and easy to work with the street department was. And we had that same experience a couple weeks ago when we were installing the Santa house. We were working with the Parks Department, and we had some volunteers out there, and everybody was just commenting on how easy to work with they were, and they went above and beyond. And it may have seemed small to them, but it did not seem small to us. They really helped us out. So there are so many ways that the city helps us, and we're really grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Are there any questions?
I do have a couple of questions, if I may.
Yeah, Mr. Phelps?
Thank you, Andrea, for
Yeah.
coming. Just as to your survey,
Yeah.
are the businesses, have they been educated, and are they keeping any stats or information about DORA-related items that may come up going forward, and
Yeah.
how proactive is Troy Main
Yeah.
Street being in that?
There are a few questions on there about the DORA specifically, and then our hope is to get a lot of that feedback from our businesses. It'll differ depending on whether they're a liquor establishment or if they're a retailer. The liquor establishments should be able to give us some pretty straightforward data because of their systems that they use. And then retailers will work with them to get some feedback. Our survey we're doing right now, and it's due December 15th, so they won't have as much experience with the DORA, but we will definitely work with them to get feedback. Yeah.
Secondly, I don't know if you're aware or if this is in fact a happening or a true thing, but is there a volunteer group that is picking up litter, patrolling down there after events and that sort of thing that has been put together by Troy Main Street, or is it strictly volunteer in the
Yeah.
community, or?
Yeah, so there are a few different things. So anytime that we have an event, we have volunteers come in afterward and clean up trash. We did that for Grand Illumination. We do that during Tour de Donut, all of those kinds of things. But then we also, throughout the summer, offer the Green Team. So that's different organizations that come in throughout the summer, and maybe they take 2 hours of their day to pick up trash downtown. And then our board this year actually did a few different downtown cleanup days, just as a way to do some board bonding and to serve the community, so.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the efforts on behalf of the board there and stuff.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hard work of you and your team. Move on to comments. Mayor Otis.
Just to echo Bobby's, Andrea, thank you very much. It's been a joy to work with Troy Main Street. We're having really great events. It's very good. Thank you. Something that some people don't seem to realize is that some people think it's the city that do all these events, and it's really Troy Main Street. So a lot of the credit goes to you guys. We're just a support team.
Okay.
That's it.
All right, thank you. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Just to start off by saying that December 23rd, 24th, and 31st, because we are in the holiday season, the city offices will be closed. Because those days are during the week and Christmas and New Year's is on Saturday, we will have the regular scheduled pickups for recycling and refuse. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Titterington. Moving on, Director of Law, Mr. Kerber.
I have no comments this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. Moving on, City Auditor, Mr. Frigge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Frigge. Do any council members have any comments this evening that they'd like to add? Seeing none, we'll move it on to any staff members in the audience have any comments. Seeing none, we'll move it up to the audience. If you wish to address council on any topic, now's your chance. Come to the podium, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume to address us on any issue that is near and dear to your heart. Seeing none, we'll adjourn this meeting. Our next meeting will be on Monday, December 20th, 2021, 7 o'clock, right here in Troy City Chamber, Troy City Council Chambers.